Hello and welcome to June's All the Everything. Welcome, welcome. And we have an incredibly juicy topic today. I was just saying in the pre-show party that happens in the Facebook group, I think it was Sarah, who was on the Wake of the Wild team, that suggested this topic, and realized that it's not something I probably have ever spoken about in any kind of depth publicly. So this is one of those ones that actually is about 3 years overdue, and hopefully will be worth the wait. So I'm going to dive straight in. Usually, if you've listened to All the Everything before, you'll know that often I'll first share what I've been up to in terms of what I've been creating, consuming, for a number of reasons. One, because the topic itself is so broad and so deep. I want to reserve time for us to really be able to explore that thoroughly. Also, as I was just sharing again in the pre-show party, I'm fresh out of a 4-day shamanic initiation, and I'm not fully with it yet. And so I think I can do justice to the topic. I probably can't add in other things as well, and it really be able to do justice to it. So I'm just going to dive straight in to the topic, the shadow pole. Do you know when your actions are still coming from fear? So what I'm planning to do is start very much at the basics in terms of, before I dive into the shadow pole, I'm just going to spend a bit of time first. And some of this, I'm sure many of you listening will already really know, but it feels important that we establish a foundation, a shared language. When we're talking about shadow, you know what I mean before we then start to talk about the shadow pole. So the word shadow is primarily a Jungian term. That's how most people, whether they know it or not, they may not have actually trained in a Jungian discipline, but ultimately forms of work that we call shadow work have their roots ultimately in Jungian work, Jungian psychotherapy. And what's really important to know is this form of work is, I guess, the latest iteration of a much more ancient practice, as many things are. Many methodologies, many practices actually have ancient roots that have kind of transformed and alchemized over the years and become known by other ways, or they may have had kind of like twists and different flavors added onto them. So shadow work is a really good example of this. And I'm not going to name all the different ways this has shown up throughout time, but the one thing I do really feel is important for us to know is, if we recognize that all of us come from the same ancient roots, the same ancient ways of living that are true for humans going back to the dawn of time, right up into fairly modern history, we all shared very similar. There were differences, of course, according to the type of land we lived in and the type of climate, but there were some really core practices, really core ways of living and relating to each other, to the land, to spirit, that we can see show up over and over again across the world. And again, right up until really the last 12,000 years or so. So, you know, 95%, let's say, of human history, we lived in much the same way. And part of that way was shamanic. And so we can call this, you know, we might say it's an indigenous life way, but another way to describe it would actually be a shamanic life way, as in the shamanic practices were deeply rooted in the way that we lived. It wasn't a kind of separate practice that existed outside of a kind of typical village. All of it's very interwoven and interlinked. So differently said, we can see that shamanic practices are just human practices. They are our birthright. They're how we evolved. And so from that lens of shamanism, the word shadow may not be the one used, We might talk about it as lost soul parts, for example, but ultimately it's the same understanding that parts of us are no longer in our kind of conscious awareness or conscious choosing, and they've been pushed away or lost. And I've probably mentioned this before, but Jung actually spent time with indigenous shamans and was very influenced by that work. I mean, some of it he absolutely was, I guess, shown in one way or another himself, you know, whether you want to say he channeled it, was shown it by spirit, however you want to see it. There were practices that he actually already had understood even before he came into contact with shamans. His work with dreams, for example, which is a key shamanic practice, he was already very, very aware of the power of way before that. But it would be ridiculous, given the very close links between a lot of Jungian work and shamanism. It would be kind of ridiculous not to recognize how much that influenced him. And so, again, I'm not saying, oh, therefore Jung copied it and there's nothing new in shadow work. There's some really beautiful ways of working with shadow that Jung developed and taught, and just recognize all of this has its roots in shamanic practices, which are, again, our human birthright. They're just natural and true for us as humans. So again, when we talk about shadow, we're talking about aspects of self. We could call that aspects of soul. For the moment, I'm just going to say aspects of self that for various reasons have been moved away from our conscious understanding of ourselves, but are still there, exerting an influence on our thoughts, on our way we speak, on our actions, on our whole lives, and often having a more powerful impact than what is in our conscious awareness. It's been pushed away for a very good reason, and then it then has a mission to keep us safe. And because it's one of the most important human drives is to stay safe, for that reason it's given a lot of power. It will exert a lot of influence from shadow. So why is that part of us? And again, for most of us, it will be many parts of us. Why is that in shadow in the first place? For the vast majority of us, this will have happened in childhood. And we could name it very simply trauma. But when we say trauma, it doesn't necessarily mean kind of extreme, textbook style trauma. To a very large extent, the very way we live in our culture, the way that we're raised, the way we're raised right from babyhood and even in the womb, that in itself can be seen as a form of trauma. It's very disconnected to what we know actually works and what serves us as human beings to allow us to be happy and healthy. So when we say trauma, we could also say trauma and conditioning, but ultimately it's all ways that we've been shown that a certain way of us being isn't safe. And that lack of safety can come in a number of ways. And I'm not going to go, again, spend lots of time here because I really want to then move into the shadow pole. But it could seem that it's not safe because it's not acceptable to others. That's a big reason why things get put into shadow. So it's not obviously unsafe in terms of, it's not like we're going to get sort of struck down dead if we carry on expressing that part of us. But there is a very real experience that if I continue being this way, my caregivers won't approve of that. Therefore, that love and that care that they have for me will be retracted. Therefore, ultimately, I would die. And of course, all of this is happening at a subconscious, very primal level. So that is an example of how it may not seem directly related to safety, but it all tracks back to safety. And then sometimes there is a very real link to safety. Those of us who've had, again, very obvious forms of trauma, a certain aspect of our being has opened us up to experience harm. And so again, that part of us will be pushed away in shadow so that we can be kept safe from experiencing that form of trauma again. There is a nuance to this, which I'm going to get into again on the shadow pole, because often it doesn't keep us safe. It often has the opposite effect, but that's the intention. All shadow ultimately has a really beautiful intention, a really good intention, which is to keep us safe. That's at the heart of all shadow. That's what it's there for. It's there, bless it, to keep us safe. You know, if that was the end of the story and it kept us safe and we could have this, you know, beautiful, fully expressed life, that would be wonderful. Of course, that isn't the case. It keeps us safe and it keeps us small and it keeps us stuck and it keeps us repressed, which is why we might even want to do the work of alchemizing shadow. So is there anything else for me to say about shadow before I start to talk about the shadow pole? I'll give some examples actually, which I'll then kind of come back to when I start to talk about the shadow pole. So an example of shadow is, and I mentioned this actually just before we started recording when I was in the pre-show party, a very common shadow expression of people that are drawn to do the work of Wake and Wild is that they have a quality that we call brilliance. And so part of the work we do is allowing people to distill, I guess, who they are at the deepest level, these kind of like innate qualities. And one of the qualities is very, very common to people drawn to Wake and Wild is the quality of brilliance. It's a quality I share as well, which is one of the reasons that people are attracted into this work. And the ways that that can show up from shadow is that it can be expressed as a kind of like superiority, a sense of like, I'm surrounded by bloody idiots. Like, this is so obvious. Why can't they see it? Why is it me that always has to like work out the, you know, the right thing to do here? And so, I'm speaking all of this, not looking out there. These are all things that I've absolutely thought. And so this is, again, a very common shadow that I witness over and over again in the people that we work with, but again, also here in me. And the reason that part of me would have been shoved into shadow in the first place, and this is the interesting part, it's not that the quality itself, it's not like I'm then unaware that I'm brilliant, but it's aspects of that have been shoved into shoved into shadow, and then are being expressed through fear in a way that I'm not aware of, which is why it then creates these kind of behaviors where we're looking out at the world and using these parts of us as a form of attack or defense. And so at some point, and sometimes it's really clear, a particular event or a particular kind of conditioning that created the shadow. Sometimes it isn't, and it's not always important. Sometimes it's going to be clear when it's really important to know why something got shoved in shadow. Sometimes it isn't, and we tend to know as we do the work. With me and brilliance, I think there probably is a fairly good reason, which is I struggled a lot in one way or another growing up. I came from a very unusual background, which I'm not going to go into now. If you haven't heard me talk about it before, just let's say it really wasn't a typical upbringing. And I'm autistic, and then ended up in, you know, very mainstream environments where I was really like struggling to make sense of what was happening, struggling with other people's misunderstanding and judgments of me. One thing I did know was I was intelligent, even if that wasn't necessarily obvious to them, because again, I was struggling to fit in. So sometimes it didn't look that way. And so this is a place where that part of me then got pushed into shadow, where it was like an aspect of the brilliance, not the whole brilliance. Not that, again, I wasn't aware that I was brilliant, but it was like a sense of, okay, this is something now I can use in defense. This is a part of me where, and again, this is where the entire shadow pole will actually hold all aspects of that particular quality. I couldn't be in a relationship with all aspects of this quality. So I was only able to be kind of expressing certain aspects of it, again, as a form of defense, where, and again, not entirely, these things are very rarely absolute, but to a large extent, was particularly when I was feeling threatened, it would come up in this way of like, this lack of understanding or this confusion is their fault. They aren't understanding me because they're just not clever enough. So this is an example of, again, how these qualities can get pushed into shadow. When I get into talk about the shadow pole, I'll explain how that can also show up the other way, but that's one example. I'm just going to see if there's another example that's worth talking about now. Yes, actually, I'm thinking I'll probably, I quite often find David Dada's a way of talking about the three-stage relationship. This is a really great example of what we're talking about here. So I'm going to talk about this at one end of the shadow pole to start with. So in David Dada's work, which is a lot about intimacy, polarity, relationships, there's 3 stages, and I'm just going to talk about the first stage for the moment, which is what we could describe as that kind of very 1950s stereotypical housewife, woman, breadwinner, man dynamic. And that is, I'm sure anyone listening can hear, that isn't this kind of like, you know, beautiful heart-led creation. There's fear that's creating that dynamic. There is this sense of transaction, and I can get my needs met if I be a certain way, act a certain way, provide a certain kind of thing. And that's happening on both sides. And so it's creating this codependent dynamic which functions, you know, all systems are winning according to the aim of that system. But you can see that is being created from shadow, it's being created from fear. So that's another example of, again, the way that shadow will show up in here, but it also shows up culturally. And this is a really great example of a cultural shadow. This isn't a one person thing. This is us as a culture had that as a shadow, where we had this very stereotypical dynamic between men and women. Okay, I'm going to go into the shadow pole. So if we now see that we've got the kind of what's here, conscious, and then outside of our conscious awareness, we have what's been placed into shadow. And so I've then been giving you examples where, and I'll go back to the one about brilliance. On that shadow pole of brilliance, at one end, there will be this self-righteous, superior, judgmental, looking down on others end of that shadow pole. At the other end is going to be the absolute opposite. So if we see that on any shadow pole, there will be an inflated end. So in this instance, an inflated end of brilliance will be believing we are the only intelligent person in the entire world, like a real inflation of that quality. At the other end, there'll be a deflation. And so at the other end of the brilliant shadow pole, there will be this sense of, I feel stupid. I feel, and this can sometimes show up in an actual belief that we are stupid or unable to sort of function in a way that other people can. Or it can be a belief that we need to pretend not to be brilliant. And so often there's like both are going to show up for people at different times. So as I explained, a lot of people that are drawn into the work Awake and Wild are brilliant. And a lot of them are also autistic or neurodivergent of some kind. And this is a really common way this will show up. And again, I've spoken a lot now about that kind of righteous end. At the other end, there's this like, I must be stupid, or they think I'm stupid. I just can't understand what is going on here. It makes no sense to me. And so that is like the opposite end, where I have you know, over my lifetime, simultaneously, not simultaneously at the same time, but like at times within the same, I don't know, social gathering, felt like the smartest person in the room and the stupidest person in the room, both. And again, this is how all shadow poles work, that within one human being, we'll tend to have an end of that shadow pole that we spend most time at, but most of us will have moments where we flip to the other side. And I'm going to say more about that flipping in a moment, but just recognize, even if it's only present to you that you occupy one end of a shadow pole, there will likely be times where you are occupying the other one, even if you're not recognizing this. And of course, all of this is only visible when we start to go into the work of understanding our shadow, illuminating our shadow. By its very nature, shadow is out of sight. It starts to become into sight once we start to do the work of consciously illuminating what's there. There's the quote that I have probably quoted and misquoted more times than any other quote, which is Jung's: until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. It will, it absolutely will, until we make it conscious, which is why we will do that work. It's the reason to do that work, which is, you know, sometimes again, the hardest, most painful work we can do, but it is so worth it, because it means we get the chance to consciously create our lives from love, as love, rather from the fear that is all we can express when we're still operating from shadow. So again, these things, even when we are starting to make these things visible, ultimately they're still shadow. So there's shadow that we've just not seen at all, and there's shadow that we're seeing, but is still there and acting on us, because even when it's seen, it can be incredibly compelling. Because again, remember, its role is to keep us safe. It has the most important job ever. So even when we've seen it, it's still going to be incredibly believable, incredibly compelling, where we can think like, okay, I get the fear's present, I get that this is this shadow part of me, and yet to not take notice of what it's telling me to do is so scary. That feels like the most unsafe thing in the world. Therefore, we are still going to be, until we've truly alchemized that shadow, we're still going to be at the mercy of it. So then going back to the example I gave with David Dada's work, if we again look culturally, that we were, which way round might we say this? I guess we could say that let's look at it this way. So at the stage one of relationships, we're in that codependent, stereotypical 1950s kind of vibe. That's like an inflated polarity. That's this kind of really treating men and women as if they're completely different, and that absolutely dictates certain kinds of behavior, certain ways of connecting, and it's kind of like full expression to an extreme, an unhelpful extreme. Then what we then went through the next phase of, which in, again, David Dada's work is called stage 2 relationships. This is when we started to go into relationships that were based on independence, seeing, well, women can do everything that men can do. We don't need to be dependent on each other. In fact, we can create all kinds of different sorts of relationships. And there was a kind of, for women, a growing movement towards feminism, which, you know, doesn't necessarily dictate any particular form of expression, but can very much inform this sense of the feminine is kind of going to make you weaker and is going to make you less able to function and do everything a man can do. And so there can be a kind of like denial and repression of the feminine, and likewise for men, there's this call for them to be more emotional, more sensitive, play more of a role in the house, more of a role with children. And so this can be, again, this repression of masculinity. And so this is, again, that deflated end of the shadow pole. So none of these things are inherently wrong. None of these things shouldn't have happened. really, all of this needed to happen for us to be able to move through the different forms of evolution rather, that are right for our culture. But recognize again, there's going to be along this pole all different manifestations, but it's furthest extreme. We've got this codependence where people are having to conform and behave in a very restricted, limited way, which allows them to have connection, but at such a great cost. At the other end, and again, its most extreme manifestation, you have people who can't really form anything like a kind of polarized, intimate relationship, because there's such a focus on how can we be independent, how can we be sort of separate units and be everything, how can we embody all qualities in one human being. So this again is a really great example of two ends of the same shadow pole, but something that's kind of happening out there culturally, but also is going to be happening inside individual human beings. Okay, I'm just going to pause and take a mouthful of my lemon and ginger tea and see where to go next with this. Okay, I'm going to give one more example before we talk about why we do this kind of flip. So, okay, this is one that actually came up in a client session this morning. I'm obviously going to keep who the client was confidential, but this particular dynamic is one that I've seen show up over and over and over and over again. It's a particularly human shadow pole, this one. So on one end, going back a couple of years ago, this person, again, ignore that it being one person, you know, many of you listening will think this, she could be talking about me. So one end of this shadow pole, going back a couple of years, there was intense need to plan and research and very methodically and cautiously make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed before any decisions made. So before booking something, really checking and doubly checking, you know, are the tickets refundable? Is it absolutely certain that people can make those dates? That kind of, you know, absolute intense focus on making sure everything that needs to be known is known before a choice is made. So we could call that the inflated end, where there's like hyper focus on knowing all the things that need to be known. Then this client recognized that over the years, as she's been in the work of illuminating shadow, that grip on I need to know all the things had flipped over to the other end of the shadow pole. And she was now in this deflated relationship to planning, where there was very little of it happening, to the point where really things that would have been really helpful to know, you know, quite basic things, weren't being researched. And so there was a number of mistakes that happened where things were booked which weren't actually, you know, possible. And with even just, you know, again, some research, that could have been avoided, but that had been created from flipping to the other end of the shadow pole, where there was kind of like, I can't plan at all because that was the way I used to do it from fear, and now I don't, so therefore I don't plan at all. And so this is a really good example of how elusive, how seductive, how illusionary this flipping to one end of the shadow pole can be. So as I say, most of us do a little bit of a kind of like subtle flip now and again anyway. When we're then in some form of work, shadow work, personal development work, spiritual work, whatever way you want to name it, and again, the less we have an understanding of it showing up as shadow, the more we're going to kind of like flip over to the other end without realizing. As we recognize, oh, I've been doing this thing, in this instance, this over planning thing from fear. Likely that would have been created from a kind of fear of I must know all the things, otherwise I'm going to make a mistake, and if I make a mistake, you know, ultimately I'm going to not be safe and then I'm going to die. Again, this is all a subconscious narrative. So once this person had realized, oh, this is something that's being created from fear, I no longer need, again, from having done the work on that, I no longer need to do this, planning all the things from fear. That movement over to the other side of the shadow pole, firstly, is change. It is change. It's not true transformation. It's not liberation. It's not true healing, but it is a change. And the reason I'm making this really important point is that's not to dismiss it, but it's also not to glorify it. So quite often what will happen is when someone's done this flip from one end of the shadow pole to the other, they'll be like, yay, I used to be an over planner, and now look at me, I'm so spontaneous and free and easy, and I don't need to plan anything. This is it, I've solved it, it's brilliant. And if we stick there and think that's all that's available and miss that we are still in shadow, we are then going back to the Jung quote, we're going to have that part of us still direct our lives. We're going to still call that fate. We're going to call the, I don't know, the shows we've not been able to make and the aeroplane tickets that we've not been able to get a refund on. We're going to say, oh, well, you know, that was life doing its thing. It was fate, but it wasn't. It was created from this other end of the shadow pole that is exerting this influence over your life. And the reason I'm saying don't make it wrong, though, is often that is, it's not always the case, but often that flip to the other end of the pole is part of transformation. It is a necessary part of healing. By doing that flip, we do start to get a sense of our possibilities, our power. It creates some space. We see, wow, I'm not only able to do this, I can also do this over here. And so if we're really consciously in this work and moving beyond the shadow pole, knowing, oh, that's okay. You know, I can see, bless me, I've been over here planning like crazy, and I've also been here not planning at all. Bless my heart. You know, this was just how my journey happened to be. It's all good, you know, a very human thing. And this is, again, really important when we're working with shadow. I was really spoke a lot about this in the pre-show party, and I'm just going to pause and talk about this here. Anytime we're working with shadow, the more warmth in terms of love, but also humor, the more warmth we can bring to it, the better. That in itself is that kind of alchemizing agent that allows us to move off the pole. It really is if we see that what has things stay in shadow is fear, being able to bring this lightness, this love to it is what allows it to create this change in this movement. And so recognizing, again, with real sweetness, like, again, seeing the innocence and the beauty and the good intentions of this part of us that's kind of gone, okay, I've been keeping her safe over here by planning all the things, and now she spotted that, but I still need to make sure I keep her safe. And so that will flip, and the mission will still be the same. And sometimes it makes no blooming sense at all. It's just like, why would now not planning all the things keep me safe? But these things, you know, often we can track a way that it does make sense. For the moment, I'm not even going to go there, but it's still trying to exert its influence to keep you safe from shadow, and recognize, oh, right, that's what's happened. You know, bless it, bless me. Here I am now at the other end of the shadow pole. And I know that I've done that flip from one end of the shadow pole to the other. And I know I also can move beyond it. So let me now talk about how do we know, which is actually the title of the show, isn't it? What was the title of the show? How do we know when our actions are still coming from fear? Because again, it can be sneaky. It can look like we have moved beyond it. Often we'll be very convinced, like, no, I'm not on the shadow pole anymore. I definitely have moved beyond it. And a key way we can know that we're actually on that shadow pole is, one, when it's a clear opposite to where we have been, and noticing, is there still some kind of reaction, rejection, resistance, or grasping onto that thing, onto that behavior? So you can see, again, in the planning example I've given, there, if we say planning in this instance is the kind of object, at the inflated end of the shadow pole, there was this reaction to planning, which was, I need to do lots and lots and lots of planning. At the other end of the shadow pole, there is like a rejection of planning. I need to do no planning. I need to be so free and easy. And you can see either side, there is this reaction to it. And that reaction, if we really are able to be honest with ourselves, we can feel that it has fear at its heart. And sometimes, again, these things are quite subtle, quite buried. We sometimes need to sort of track back and be in inquiry, and very much have other people to give us these reflections to see, oh, okay, it seemed to make perfect sense to now be doing the thing I'm doing. And I can see that it's actually a rejection of the thing. And it often is, it can be also a rejection of the other end of the shadow pole. So often we'll do this in terms of being in reaction to the way that we've been raised, for example. And so we'll think, I've freed myself, I'm outside of the grip now of my upbringing and how my parents treated me. And not realizing that we're still in relationship with it. We're still in reaction. We're still a victim to it. We're still creating life from a place of not that. So these are ways that we can, again, in inquiry and bringing the warmth to it, start to notice like, oh, bless my heart. I really thought I've moved beyond that, but I haven't. I've just moved to the other end of the shadow pole, and that is all good. It was necessary, no wrong making here, and it's not the place I need to stay. And this is the really important, like, if there's one thing I really, really want you to hear here, it is entirely possible for us to move beyond the shadow pole. In short, for us to no longer be driven by this fear, for us to alchemize what was in shadow, bring it back into the system. So it's then part of our conscious expression. And so again, coming back to the example of brilliance, the more work I've done to alchemize that, bring it back into my conscious awareness, for it to be an expression from love, the more that's something that very rarely now shows up at one end of the shadow pole or the other. It would take a lot of challenge for any remaining parts of me to be triggered by into that shadow expression. Like, it's extremely rare. Most of the time, it's not even really in my awareness particularly, but it's part of my expression. It's part of my gift, part of the reason I do what I do is my brilliance allows me to process very clearly, very fast, and be able to articulate them just like I have been doing today. And so this is an example of how the more we're able to alchemize these qualities back into the system, they then become in service to our soul, in service to our heart. So, sorry, the dogs are rolling around in the background groaning. So the more, and again, this instance, brilliance is being expressed from love. It means that I can be my medicine, doing the work I do with people, and brilliance is in service of it. I'm no longer, for example, teaching and doing it in a way where I'm kind of like doing it from a place of superiority, like, oh, I'm so much more intelligent than all these people. Or the opposite, oh my goodness, maybe they're going to think I'm stupid because I'm expressing it in a way that just really doesn't make sense to them. Both those things are now, there were things that were quite often present for me going back, certainly like 10 years ago or so. Now very rarely are, because of the work I've done to alchemize those parts of me that were shoved away in shadow. Okay, so when we move then, we've done the alchemy, we've moved and brought this piece of us back into the system. It creates a union, it creates a marriage. And we could look at that marriage, that union, in many different ways. We could see it as a union between the human, that part of us that's kind of here as a unique fractal, and has come in this particular body, in this particular, brain, this particular form. And we can really see this as a union between that and soul. We can also see it as a union between us and the object. So in the example of the planning, there is a union that then takes place between the person and their relationship to planning, where again, they can then plan in a way that's just serving. It's just true. It's just what's being called for in the moment. And I'm going to go back again to the David Dada example, because this really is a beautiful example of, it's a bit like here's one I prepared earlier, a beautiful example of the union that's present and possible for us beyond the shadow pole. So at the stage 3, so if I recap again, at stage 1, we've got that 1950s, very stereotypical kind of dynamic. At stage 2, we've got that very independent, kind of separate people kind of coexisting to an extent, but very much kind of doing their own thing. When we then move beyond that, we then become available for what we could call divine union. And this is going to look very different for each person. So I'm about to talk in very general terms, and I'm doing that just to really be able to illustrate this journey through the polarities. It's not by no means saying like this is what's true for all men and all women. But if we look at, again, we're looking at this through the lens of, in this instance, heterosexual men and women going through these different stages. When they reach that 3rd stage, they become available to consciously choose into, be in devotion to, embody and express whatever is true for them, which could be, for example, for a woman to really embody that true archetypal feminine that feels absolutely wonderful for her to live from, for her to experience. And then on the other side, to be in relationship with a man who is in deep honoring of the archetypal masculine. And from there, coming together in this true union, a relationship that is, you could describe as interdependent. So there isn't a codependence. Like if they chose to, they absolutely could function beautifully in the world if that's what they chose. And yet they choose to come together in union, knowing that is the most beautiful, soulful expression of relationship that they can co-create. And so that, again, in that instance, I'm talking about relationship, but that form of being at choice, being at sovereign choice, no longer a victim to the thing, but being in sovereign relationship to allows us to make choices that are actually aligned to our souls, or what we came here for. Okay, I'm just going to see if there's anything else I want to share on that before I move into kind of what you can do next. If this is sounding like something you'd like to take a look at, I'll give a little summary of how you can do that. Just see if there's anything else worth. One final example that feels helpful, particularly for listeners, this show, many of which I know will have come from an ascension-based spirituality like non-duality, the 3 principles. This is an example of how I see the shadow pole show up, especially for those of us that have come from that background. And this is an example where it's really important to recognize the nuances in what I'm saying. I'm not saying ascension spirituality in itself is on the shadow pole. I'm absolutely not saying that. To be really clear, I'm not saying that at all. It's only ever, again, our relationship to it. So, and I'm going to talk personally here. This is something I see play out over and over and over again out there, particularly again in spiritual communities. But I'm going to speak personally because this is very much my own experience. So like most of us raised in this culture, I was very attached to my wounded victimy stories, my stories that it wasn't possible for me to do this. It wasn't possible for me to have this. Certain people did certain kinds of things. These stories looked very real, very true, very important for me to keep telling, keep repeating, to keep creating life from. So that was how I was. And you could say this was a inflated relationship to stories, where they become, you know, like hyper real, hyper important, hyper factual, hyper fixed, very permanent relationship to these stories. When I then had what some might call a kind of like awakening, where in short, I was just blasted open to spirit over the course of that year, as I moved more and more into an experience of oneness, of a non-separation with everything, my relationship to stories became that, like, stories are meaningless. Like, what on earth was I doing all that time believing those stories? They are just a waste of energy. Oh my goodness, how boring, you know, humans getting caught up in their stories. I remember going back years ago, we used to, some of you may well have joined us for it. We used to run a course called Happy School. And there was actually a class in that school that was called something like, who would you be without your story? And so that was a very real manifestation of where we were then, which was this sense of, like, if you don't have your stories, if you're not running stories, you will be free, you'll be home and dry, like everything's possible. And so again, none of what I'm saying is inherently about ascension spirituality. It really is not. It's very specifically this experience of you know, non-duality, let's say, and the relationship it can create about stories, where there's this real rejection of them. And again, notice what I said earlier, we can tell when we're still on the shadow pole, when we have this very, like, pronounced rejection, resistance, reaction to the thing. And so this instance is real, like, reaction. Oh my goodness, it's like getting caught up in a story. Oh, I'm just so over this whole thing around, you know, making meaning of things. What again, talking personally, what has lain beyond, so I'm getting tongue twisted, what's been beyond that shadow pole for me personally, and is now very much part of the work that we do with others, is to have this gorgeously creative, sovereign relationship to stories, recognizing that humans are inherently story creating machines. We love stories. We are driven by narratives. To try and deny that is actually just to deny a truth about human beings. But the fact is, we don't need to be at the mercy of them. They can be the most just gorgeous, beautiful, mythical way of living when we are consciously creating our stories. We're consciously creating narratives that allow us to kind of move into greater, and ultimately this is where, you know, if you know me at all, you'll know that I love archetypes. Really what we see is these deeper, rather than these stereotypical stories that we're trapped in when we're still from fear, we move into these really great archetypal narratives, the myths, the stories of gods and goddesses and kings and queens and heroes and heroines and dragons and unicorns. It opens us up to this absolutely beautiful, magical, enchanted world where we create stories consciously. And so for me, that's what's, again, I'm talking personally, but I could also be talking about so many people that are in the work Awaken the Wild. This relationship we have to story no longer is this, you know, reaction one way or the other. It's actually this gorgeous union where we can co-create with story. So I think I've said everything I wanted to say on the topic of understanding this shadow pole and how to know we're still on it. If this is something that you're starting to recognize, oh, this feels really interesting, I can see aspects of this showing up, I'm going to talk about a few things that I see are absolutely essential for us to be able to move off that shadow pole into union, into our truth, into the fullness of our souls. And the first one is a willingness to see the truth. And sometimes that is going to be so hard to recognize ourselves. And again, in the examples I've given, you know, it can be hard to recognize ourselves as being superior and self-righteous. Really can be. But the only way we can possibly move beyond it is to be really honest with ourselves, to be really willing to see the truth. And added to that, knowing that sometimes we can't see the truth ourselves, we can definitely be in the work of looking for it. Most of us will need other people that can help reflect that to us. So obviously that's the role that Jonathan and I very much play with the people who are in the work of Wake in the Wild. We'll be firstly giving them invitations into practices and rituals to allow them to see that shadow, but we'll also be in the work with them to say, hey, you know, one way or another, this is shadow, or look, can you see you've gone from one end of the shadow pole to the other? And so that is, as far as I can see, for most of us, essential for us to be able to truly see when we're in shadow. We can't do that alone. It very much is something that's in our blind spot, and we need someone else to be that mirror for us. And then the last thing I've already mentioned is it absolutely requires more love than we think is possible. And again, that requires love from ourselves to ourselves. But also, again, if we're going to be working with other people that are going to hold that mirror, they need to also be able to hold that mirror of love. If we're working with people who are shaming us, even subtly, for places that we're in shadow, that will create a kind of like freezing of that shadow. It won't feel safe. We won't feel safe for the alchemy to happen. So it absolutely is essential that that person that we're choosing as that mirror, we know that they are able to hold us with complete love, even on our sort of greatest shadow expressions. And believe me, you know, in the work that we do, sometimes things can get, you know, quite messy, quite shadowy. And the reason Jonathan and I do the work we do is that honestly, we love shadow. We love people in that shadow expression. We love what's held in shadow, which really comes to a final point I want to make. What I haven't said so far is it's, I guess, been kind of inherent in a lot of what I've said, but the thing I really want to leave you with is this part of us that's in shadow, we can absolutely relate to as being something quite monstrous, something repellent, something unwelcome, again, because it will often have, you know, either in the shadow pole, won't be particularly appealing once we start to really see it. Important thing to know is it's something so precious. It's a part of us that is incredibly beautiful, magical, powerful, and necessary. It really is. We talk about gold in shadow. That's what it is. It is this beautiful, precious part of you that's in shadow. It doesn't look like it's beautiful and precious and perfect because it's in shadow. But once you're able to reclaim it, that alchemy really allows you to know it as the gold it is. So that's everything I have to say on the shadow pole. If you've got any questions, the best place to ask them is probably the Primal Happiness Facebook group. So if you're not already a member, come join us, and that's at facebook.com/group/primal happiness, and feel free, ask a question there, and one way or another we will come back to you. If you would like our support in doing this work, we've got one space left in the upcoming round of Waking the Wild Sovereign, which is our crucible, which is currently the most intimate way to work with this. So it includes one-to-one time with Jonathan and I. And a big part of the work we do is exactly what we've just been talking about, the work of alchemizing shadow. So that starts later this month. And I say we've got one space left. We're already in conversation with several people, but if you are really feeling the call to do this work of alchemy, to bring your gold out of shadow, to rise into that inner king or queen archetype, do book a call with one of us. And you can do that at primalhappiness.co/WTWS. If you are either watching this live in the Facebook group or watching it on YouTube and you haven't already started listening to our podcast, go listen, go subscribe even at primalhappiness.co/podcast. And is there anything else? Oh, yes. I'm going to mention our beautiful Moonly newsletter. So on every full moon and new moon, we send out an absolute cornucopia of goodness in our newsletter, and it's called the Moonly News. And it's really a kind of roundup of all the different things we've created over the past couple of weeks. It always surprises me how much is in there, plus other bits and pieces that kind of allow you to be invited into inquiries and rituals, all that take you a kind of step deeper on the path of Waking the Wild. And you can subscribe to that at primalhappiness.co/moonly. That's all for this month. Thank you so much for joining me, whether you've done that live or you're listening to the podcast or you're watching the replay. I so appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining me. I love you. Mwah. Have a wonderful rest of your day.